Just to track back just a little, where's the book set? Well, 2,500 years ago. And we'll see in some ways the world hasn't changed too much. And the world needs Jesus just as much, because the people of Israel had been taken over by the empire of the day, the Babylonian Empire, current day Iraq. And for 20 years, they'd been fighting, negotiating treaties, etc., etc. But the people of Israel had not accepted the peace terms, and so over a period of about 18 years, the Babylonians had gradually taken more of the people from Jerusalem into exile, taken them. So we're thinking of 10,000 people walking 1,000 miles into exile in Babylon. So in the city, and the culmination was they destroyed the city. They destroyed the temple. And they left only a few elderly and a few young people. It was a complete picture of devastation. Jeremiah the prophet has been warning the people for 40 years, would you believe? 40 years, what would happen, because they were living in a state of social depravity. They didn't look after the poor. They didn't look after their neighbors. They lived how they wanted to. So he'd been warning them. The worst time came was the king. He had all his sermons and he burnt them publicly to show their defiance. And so that devastation came after a long result of the people not listening to God. Just to see how, compare it today. Thank you, B. Their temple was burnt. There's Notre Dame Cathedral burning. Their temple was burned. That place which symbolized them the presence of God among them. Their temple was burnt down. Thank you. Their walls were smashed. 80% of the city was destroyed. That's it. Mariupol. Thank you. The king was sent into exile. He was blinded and he was sent into exile. There's Jimmy Chirizier in Haiti, named Mr. Barbecue for sinister reasons. No government in there. So no temple, no city, no leadership. A time of absolute devastation. So that's the time we're looking at. So the fact that we can use pictures from today shows that in some ways human beings have not changed. The need for God to speak to us is as great today with all our progress, everything. Thank you. So it's a time really where a time of devastation. Last week, Katie introduced you to this figure, the daughter of Zion, as if the city is speaking out as a woman, lamenting her situation, saying, I don't know, we can't go on, we've lost everything, and lamenting before God. Well, by the chapter we come to today, chapter 3, she's really hit breaking point. She's no longer able to talk again. She's no longer able to talk. And you remember Katie last week said, what cannot be mentioned cannot be managed. It's important to be able to talk, because if you don't talk, if you don't articulate, you cannot receive healing in your heart. So they've reached a point of the lowest point. She's hit break. If we can just go back, B. You can see no future. There's a little word there. People are sitting on the ground, and I've seen people after civil wars and conflicts sitting on the ground. It's a passive state. You're sitting, your captors are standing above you, and really you're sitting, you've given up. Nothing you can do. The person sitting is, of course, at the mercy of the person standing. And just to watch women I saw in Burundi just sitting down, it was an eloquent symbol of a feeling of helplessness. So that's the state that the book is. No future. They're sitting down. And at the end of chapter 2, the sense that the sign of hopelessness is that the mothers no longer have hope for their children. A terrible verse. Should women eat their offspring, whatever has happened, perhaps the children have died and the women are forced to eat them, it's some unmentionable, unspeakable kind of horror in this situation. So mothers can no longer care for their children. Complete the opposite. There's no future. There's no future. Young men and young women have fallen by the sword. So there's nothing to look forward to. And even a sense that God is their enemy. Those I cared for and reared, my enemy has destroyed. So their faith in God has fallen. But we have learned from last week the power of lament. We still have something we do. We can speak out. We can speak. And now, a person called the man, the prophet, the poet, the writer, he's going to do the speaking. The woman has come silent. She has spoken very graphically, very bravely. But somehow she's come to the end of herself. Her hope has gone. But we're going to learn that even though sometimes you reach out to God above, you feel there's no answer, God is also beneath as well. There's no low point you can get to where God is not there. So sometimes we find God beneath rather than God above. And this is the situation that the city is in. Our pain is overwhelming. Your only hope. And today my intention is to find from this chapter how hope is reestablished. How hope is reestablished among the people. Thank you, B. So lament is a Christian language. It's good to pour out your heart to God when things are not going right. And this chapter will take us really in several dimensions. It's me. It's how I'm feeling. It's me and God. It's us, how we are feeling. There's that corporate dimension. There's me and others. We can sometimes think, well, we're living comfortably, but we know our Christian brothers and sisters elsewhere, so we extend our boundaries and say, well, these prayers and these words can be spoken on behalf of others. We can lament for them. We can pray for them. And of course, it helps our openness and our relationship to people outside us. It can touch our hearts so we can sometimes feel what others are feeling if we allow lament to speak to us. So there's those dimensions, personal, corporate, wider church, and then wider world. So whichever way you're thinking of this, you may be applying them in one of those particular ways. But grief and hope belong together. We don't have a perfect life on earth. There'll always be pluses and minuses. Grief and hope. Perhaps the book is teaching us to learn that the grief is still there. The grief will remain until the end of the book when Josh finishes it next week. But the hope can also stand. It's that hope I want to give the platform for hope today. We're going back, B. We're going back. So chapter 3 is this acrostic. So every line of the poem begins with the same letter from A to Z. It's as if you like, it's giving an A to Z picture, an encyclopedic picture of the world, encyclopedic picture of the sufferings they're having. And this one, all three lines of the stanza begin with the same letters. You don't just get one A, you get A, B, B, B in the Hebrew language. There's a intensifying. The repetition, as it were, intensifies. So just as in some ways the sense of lostness and grief, and here they are, a city without walls, their best and brightest are either dead or they've gone hundreds of miles away, they don't know they'll ever see them again. They say that 80% of the city was smashed, no weddings, no schools. It's just a bomb site, as we would say. So it's intensifying the suffering, but also intensifying the way that people could look forward. And the person who's speaking, as you see in chapter 3, it'd be good to open the Bible to chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction. The man speaks as a representative of the city. As a poet, he speaks for them. He puts into words their feelings. He puts into words what they would like to say if they felt eloquent and able to speak. So he puts those into words. He's a poet speaking for them, but also he's a prophet. He's speaking to them. He's speaking words of God to them. And that's where the hope comes from. That's where the promise comes from. And those prophets, and this man is quite possibly Jeremiah. He's not, you'll see, his name is not affixed to the book at the start, but it's quite possibly Jeremiah. And the prophets, you remember Jeremiah and Hosea, they would often use their own lives to illustrate the people's relationship with God and how God helped them. Just with Hosea, he married a woman and she ran away from him. She left him. And God showed him that was a picture of what Israel had done to God, how God had brought them to himself and then they had been unfaithful to him. So he said, your life as a prophet has exemplified this very hard lesson of what Israel has done to me. And Jeremiah, as a faithful servant, he was put into a terrible pit. Just a muddy pit, and just left there. And at the end of the chapter, he uses that experience to say, just as I was down in the pit, but God somehow heard my cry from the pit and lifted me up. So Israel, when you cry out to God, when you pour out your heart before God, he will rescue. So those prophets, their lives actually speak to the people God uses. So you can see it's a very close identity. The prophet must love the people a lot to allow his life to be an example of the pain and suffering they've been through. And that's what the prophet does. And of course, in many ways, these prophets and this speaker, they foreshadows the work of Jesus Christ. And in some ways, it gives us a new window onto God, a God who is so much for us, he takes our sin and our suffering on himself. A God who is for us, bearing our pain and our alienation from God, and also with us in the Lord Jesus. So as this time, we can see that actually the people are beginning to think about God perhaps in a new way, or understand part of the scripture in a new way, to see this God who is for them and with them in their extremity, far from God leaving them. In fact, God comes to us in the incarnation, in the crucifixion, in the resurrection. So the book is foreshadowing that. Thank you, B. So it's just good, as we just go on that track, to see Lamentations in the light of the rest of Scripture, of course. We read this book as Christians. So the context of the book is the covenant relationship with God. That's the context of the book. This a God-initiated agreement with Israel. You will be my people. I will be your God. A lifelong partnership with obligations. So God took on Israel and said, you'll be my people. I want to show the world who I am through you, through your society, through your faith, through your worship. So it's the covenant relationship. God has said, you are mine. And it's a lifelong partnership. It's an unbreakable partnership. So this, when the people speak, last week in that lamenting, it's an act of faith. They're speaking to their God. So these strong words, people say, God, where are you? Why have you done this? Why have you let, is actually in the context of fidelity, in the context of trusting God. You are our God, but you seem not to be doing what we want you to do. That can happen in life sometimes, can't it? It's good to be honest and open before God. So it's an act of fidelity, not unbelief, to let God know what's going on. What's the point of hiding it? So in some ways, the speaker sees, but so it's an act of fidelity, it's an act of clinging obstinately to God, even though your words are not words of love and worship at this stage. But it's an act of clinging obstinately. If you like, the speaker sees God as a frenemy, a friend stroke enemy in a way. Even when God's inaction, God's judgment leads to overwhelming chaos, he is still the one to whom we are to turn. I've got just a little sketch here, so perhaps Josh can help me, and perhaps it's a picture which you'll be aware this the best place? There's a son and there's a father. Okay?
Dad, what have you done? I can't believe it. That's the worst thing that...
Hope and sorrow coexist. Next picture.
Sorry.
So, I was just very impressed just seeing this art exposition called Tears of Gold. The artist Hannah Rose Thomas. And she has painted women who've been in the most dire situations. You just think who that might be. Well, the Yazidi women in Iraq and Syria, Rohingya women in Burma, Gazan women, Nigerian women with Boko Haram, women who've been abused and oppressed and lost everything. And she paints them. And she often paints them with their tears. And she encourages them to paint themselves. So obviously when she's painting, she's listening to their stories. As we heard last week, she's listening, she's encouraging them to speak. Because she's valuing them as individuals. You have got something I want to hear. So she's valuing them, showing us the power of expressing what's really on our heart, even if it's bad stuff. So the healing power of listening, bearing witness. And she's going to paint and say, this woman's got something to say. This woman can teach us something. She's not just a helpless victim, but to celebrate dignity beyond victim. To restore that personhood as they begin to paint themselves and their children. To give them a sense of worth, a sense of future. And of course, a sense of belonging to a group of people who've been through experiences like that. So the other pictures just in the text will be relating to this exhibition, Tears of Gold. Really, the hope begins to start as we break the wall of vulnerability. We express our need. So hope comes, as we'll see, from really hopelessness. Thank you. So hope dies and lives again. So here at the start of chapter 3, there is very strong language. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. So he speaks of God as the good shepherd, but somehow who assaults his people, not protects them. He's become a bad shepherd. And so he ends those first verses in chapter 18. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He's trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. This is verse 18 of chapter 3. all I'd hoped for from the Lord. So there's a chain of metaphors expressing that the people have lost their expectation in God. It's inverted all the promises. The promises become almost counterfactual. Shepherd? No. A shepherd who assaults and not protects. So his whole way of thinking about God has got inverted. He's got changed. So the first thing for hope to arise again is that bad memory has to be mitigated. Bad memory has to be changed. And just a little story, and I certainly understand that these situations are very real, and I've been there myself, but just a troubled man, okay? He's driving through the countryside, and his tire goes. He has a flat tire. He looks in his boot. No jack. This is a troubled man. He's lived a life of trouble. You could say he looks at the downside. He immediately gets angry. He's angry at himself. Why didn't I put my spare in the boot? Why is it not there? Why is it not there? So he goes to look for a spare. As he's walking, anger gets hold of him. I shouldn't have done that. What a fool I am. What a fool I am. I'm always getting this situation. Why does this happen to me? And he's going on, and he's going to a farmer's house, and he goes towards the farm. And but by the time he's got very angry with himself, angry with what life has done for him, angry as how people won't understand him. So here he is. He's coming to the door of the farmer to ask for his help. The farmer opens the door, a lovely, rosy-faced, cheerful farmer. But before the farmer can say anything, the man shouts out, "Keep your jack! Keep it!" You can't even ask for it. Just asking makes it worse. And so it's as if the people have got that situation. The more they think about God, they only think of what God hasn't done. They only think about their situation. So we need, the first part of getting to hope, we need to mitigate our bad memory. You know how flashbacks and things, our bad stuff can keep recurring to us. We need somehow to find a calm and a pause in it, and not let the flashbacks, not let the bad memories just to encompass in the future. So hope comes after hopelessness. Remember when God promised Abraham and Sarah to have a child, but Abraham was over 90 years old. It says, when there was no hope, in hope, Abraham believed. So his hope began to rise when his human position was hopeless. I don't know how that works. But that seems to be when we've given up hope, perhaps in everything we can see around us, that's when hope can be born again in our hearts. Reading about people in the concentration camp. I read about a lady called Corrie ten Boom, taken to Ravensbrück in 1941-42 to the concentration camp. Going to the guards, the only thing they had was a Bible. Somehow they got the Bible through all the preliminary requirements before they had to. They secreted it away. She was just going to the hut, and there was one final search. And these ladies, they just had a little shift on, and her Bible was hidden underneath the blouse. And they were just going, and the guard was searching them all. Suddenly, as the queue went, he said, "Okay, on you go, go, in you go." And they had their Bible in their hut. And that hut, where the Bible came, they began to take Bible studies. They read God's word there. And that hut, back to 28, was known as the crazy place where they hoped. The crazy place where they actually dared to hope. Corrie's hope was fulfilled when she had a wonderful life, after a life of ministry testifying that God was in the place of hopelessness. So hope is not just resilience or optimism. I love the story of the two salesmen in Africa. Last century, somewhere, shoe salesmen. They're both starting, they've been given dispatch. The first one goes there, he sends a telegram back, break the contract. No one wears shoes here. Let me come home. The second one says, no one has got shoes here. Send a whole new container full, because nobody has them yet. He's the one with hope. Same situation, but the one with hope sees the possibility. But hope is just, Christian hope is more than resilience. It's a forward-looking confidence that God will do good. Hope is this confidence that God will do good. It's an attitude that God will make a better tomorrow. So hope is an attitude. Where does it come from? It comes from an event. It comes from God's promise that God has called us as a people. He'll be with us, and he has promises. So it's an attitude based on an event. Based on, so in other words, hope is not flimsy. Hope is not hoping for the best, but it's an attitude based on an event. What God done, God chose a people. He made promises. And he has fulfilled those promises in Christ. Because Christ died and rose again, those hopes we have in God can be fulfilled. And of course, hope leads from an attitude, it leads to action. So hope means that you start your life again, as it were. An attitude based on an event, but leading to action. And the speaker is going to say that as hope is born in you, it can lead you to act. You can begin to think again there can be a future, even though you're sitting and everything has been lost. So here we are, just as we come to the last 5 minutes. Thank you. So here's just a portion we will concentrate on. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, my soul is cast down within me. Yet this I call to mind, therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning, great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to one who seeks him. It's good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It's good for a man to bear the yoke when he's young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust, there may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and to him be filled with disgrace. Here is right at the center of the book, and here are just a few verses concentrating on hope. If you count the words hope and waiting, come 4 times in those verses. Hope and waiting. It's the same word, really. They're coming 4 times. Yet this I call to mind. I have hope. How are they calling hope to mind? I think it just comes from speaking the word, the Lord, at the end of chapter 18. Remember those verses we read when the lady of Jerusalem said, all I'd hoped for from the Lord has gone. But just that word Lord is a sort of trigger. The Lord. What does that mean? What's the truth of the word the Lord? Thank you, Bee. Hope rises from the Lord. So somehow calm comes the person, the Lord. Who is the Lord? Who is this person who has called us and been with us? Who is this one? Well, that word, the Lord, it has that sense, I am. He's the God who exists, the God who's above all circumstances. He's the God who's above all circumstances. He's not dependent on anyone else, anything else. World conditions don't affect him. He is the one who's am. He's sheer existence. He doesn't need anyone else. Another word for that is the same name that God also showed, El Shaddai. He's the God who's at his best when we are at his worst, at our worst. He's the God who's at his strongest when we are at our weakest, El Shaddai. When Abraham had nothing, that's when God helped him. So our God is the God who's at his best when we're at our worst. So hope rises from the Lord, the one who lives above all circumstances, who's not swayed by what has gone on. And so he calls to mind, there's an intentional memory taking over his traumatic memory, if you like. Yet this I call to mind, this I call to my heart, says in verse 21. And of course, when God spoke first that name to Moses, I am what I will be what he will be, what he was saying is that he is the God who's going to show himself in the things he did for Moses and the people in Egypt. In other words, he's the God who rescues his people from the most dire difficulties. That's the content of his name. So who is the God who they are following? The God who, when we were slaves, when we had nothing, when we were locked in, he was the God who was able to spring the trap, open the door. So as they begin to concentrate on God, we could see how hope could rise. Our God is not just a God who's pushed around by circumstances. Our God is not just a God who's overcome by human powers. Our God is the one who's gracious, full of compassion, full of mercy, full of power, the God who set his people free. We remember God's great love, which never lets us go. In this wonderful verse, 23, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. His compassions never fail. And probably that reads better, because of the Lord's great love, which is never consumed. The Lord's love does not fail. The Lord's love does not fail. Often we hear people saying, well, we had a great beginning, we fell in love, but we fell out of love. God doesn't fall out of love. His love never fails. It's good to wait quietly for the Lord. It's good for man to bear the yoke while he's young. And then we see the same thing, and this is often seen as the very centre of the chapter. When all the words are put together, these are actually the central words of the book. And with that, remember that acrostic, the same letter is starting each word, verse 31. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. For though he brings grief, he will show compassion, so great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. So, no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. And this word from love, it has the word steadfast. It's unfailing. It's a love which is committed to. The sure mercies of God, sometimes the old translation. He does not willingly bring affliction. Anger, discipline is not God's primary intent. But grief, God acts in love. Love is his true characteristic, not anger or wrath. So we move on to the last slide. The good that arises from hope. So there's just a sense of beginning to trust in God's goodness. You know, we live in a world where many people indulge what's called recreational cruelty. You see lots of it in social media. There's somehow satisfaction in making other people feel bad, sending nasty comments. God doesn't do that. Even those he shows mercy to, he never humiliates. God is good. His intentions for us are good. He wants others to flourish. It doesn't detract from him if other people are doing well. God's good. The psalmist is learning to wait. Waiting, I suppose, is an admission that we're powerless, isn't it? Waiting for somebody, you put yourselves in their hands. But the psalmist is waiting. It can be a positive thing. It can engender humility. It can engender patience. It can be really looking for God's solution and not the solution we worked out for ourselves. So he's learning to wait. He's in the school of humility. I just read about this marathon runner who done the Barclay Marathon, 100 miles in 60 hours. And you know, we often say these things. When I do these extreme sports, I really find out about myself. I find out what's in me. Well, even more beautiful truth is that when we're in extremes, we find out what's in God. We find out what sort of God he is. And hope bows to sovereignty. And just my last thought is just to say that if we become a community of hope, we learn to hope for ourselves, we realise that there can be a better tomorrow. That as long as God is with us, there's a possibility that new things can come. Our attitude can change. And our actions can reflect our trust in the future. And if that becomes part of us as a community, illustrated by that tug-of-war picture. So, learning to hope has the potential to create a community. community of people who care for each other, a community of people who care for the wider church, and a community of people who care for the world. At the bottom there, David Kasali was a young man. He was in a college which I knew in Nairobi. Nairobi is a peaceful place. But his hometown in the Congo was in the midst of that Congo conflict. 250 people had died. He decided to go back to Congo in the midst of the conflict. Many were leaving. He said, the only thing you can do is not to counter violence by violence, but counter violence by love and hope. And he built a university in the midst of a war zone. That war zone, 5 million people have died in the Congo. 200,000 women have been raped. It's the worst place on earth in many ways for people to live. But he went back there and he built a Christian university because he wanted to train new leaders. He saw leadership as a sign of hope for the future. So when we work together, we embrace lament, we can become a people who brings hope.